name is Elaine Liu. I am a professor and a director at the City University of New York, John Jay College. Welcome to our dialogue series with the New York City government on the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we have Katherine Benjamin with us. She is the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Digital Services at the New York City Mayor's Office of the Chief Technology Officer. She led the collaboration with U.S. Digital Response, a group of volunteer technologists, to develop databases utilized by multiple agencies to help manage the city's pandemic response efforts. Katherine, good to have you here.
Wonderful to be here, Professor Liu. I'm so excited to talk with you.
So Katherine, let me start with this question. Tell us a little bit about your agency.
Wonderful. Well, the New York City Mayor's Office of the CTO has a mission to ensure that technology is inclusive, accessible, and delivers opportunity for all New Yorkers. And so the work of our office is guided by both the city agencies within the city of New York and also mayoral offices within the city. And we have four main areas that we focus on. The first is universal broadband. The second is tech and society. The third is inclusive innovation. And the final area is my area, digital services.
Thank you. Thank you. So as we know, you got the award for your response in the COVID-19 pandemic efforts. So my question is, during this pandemic, what was the problem you had to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So when COVID-19 first hit, as you know, it was a big surprise. People didn't necessarily see it coming. And one of the things that we knew is that we needed to get surge support for technology. So that means that what we needed were more technologists. So certainly the city of New York, and actually, any government around the world, and I say that because as part of COVID response, one of the things technology teams like ours were doing was talking to all sorts of other digital teams and government teams to saying, hey, what are you doing? How are you doing this? It was actually quite incredible. And what we saw was, we just need more technologists on the ground to scrub in and to help out. And so we had this idea that what if we could get sort of digital era 21st century skills into government quickly and to help deploy them to these mayoral offices or to these agencies that need additional support as part of COVID-19. And so originally we had been doing these sort of ad hoc engagements working with the US Digital Response. And that's a pro bono organization that brings together volunteers from across the tech ecosystem to work on government projects. So we had been doing a project, for instance, with them where we quickly pulled together data related to where a PPE was in the city. So it was aggregating data on that. And my colleague Alexis led a huge amount of that work. And the idea was sort of built off these ad hoc projects, sort of saying, well, if we did it in these smaller ways, what if we actually did it at scale in a slightly more coordinated manner? So we had this idea of a fellowship. We do 10 weeks. Originally, we started with 8 weeks and we scaled it to 10 weeks where people come in, teams come in and they sort of deploy onto one specific project. And for those weeks, they quickly go from a project kickoff all the way to doing some sort of useful solution for that problem. And so we came up with sort of a model that did that.
Nice, nice. So basically, I think this is about forging partnership in crisis, right? And how to forge it fast, not only good ones, but also fast ones, right? So I think what you were talking about touch on many of the things that we in the universities has been studying. For instance, we often now not only see citizens as recipients of government services, but also governments need to draw on the expertise among citizens to form partnership in service delivery. So I was curious to know, what are the key takeaway points you can share in terms of how to forge partnership in crisis fast and meaningful?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think what was unique about this project specifically, I'm sure some of the learnings are applicable no matter what problem you're solving, but in the technology space specifically, there is a set way of working and doing things. And I often give the analogy of playing sports. And so there's a set of sort of flexible rules about how, if you work in a startup or if you work in a tech company, a way that digital products are built. And so some of the words you might hear are things like agile or Kanban or Scrum. And these are product development and product management approaches. But why they are so helpful is it's like if you were trying to organize a pickup game of soccer. Those things like Scrum or Kanban, think of that as the rules of the game of soccer. So as long as people know the rules of the game, everyone can just show up at the field and start playing soccer, even if they've never met, because they're familiar with the rules. And that's how you can do a pickup game of soccer. Similarly, that's kind of how these product teams work, is that by using these 21st century digital era ways of working that are just completely normal, and you'd see if you've worked at a startup or if you've worked in a leading digital government team, we really leaned on those to say, this is what we're looking for. And it enabled partnerships to thrive because people could put their hand up and say, yeah, I know what that is, and I can totally do that, and I want to join you. So part of it was making sure that we're all speaking the same language and communicating our goals really clearly. And within that, a big part of the New York City Mayor's Office of the CTO's job in this, and working with my colleague Alexis, who helped to lead this program and was my co-lead in this, it was working with our agency partners to understand what their needs were, then parlaying those back to the technologists to say, okay, this is what we're hearing from these groups of people, and saying, this is the project, this is the scope of work, this is what's needed, this is how it needs to be built, these are the technologists, and now go. And we did that very, very quickly.
Do you have like impact assessment of, given the technology you put in there, like what difference does it make?
In our last cohort of Innovation Fellows, we worked on a project with the Department of Finance, and it was on one of their most heavily used websites. It's called CityPay. It's responsible for doing over $15 billion in transactions a year. And of course, we want to make it very easy for people to interact with that site, because we don't want people leaving their homes and going to try to do something in person unnecessarily. And so when we did work to improve the user experience and the usability of that site, what we saw was in the analytics, when we went in to see who's going to the website, how long are they there, what are they doing, are they getting what they needed, we saw actual measurable change. So things like fewer people leaving the site before they got what they needed. We saw people spending less time trying to do the thing they needed, so they were able to do it more efficiently. We saw that there was usage on the site was going up. And then more broadly, we know that when we do things like that, a really important measure is that it means that everyday New Yorkers are spending less time transacting on a government website, which might not be the first choice of things that they want to do, and more time being able to do things like support their children doing their homework or applying for a job or other things. And so those are some examples of like the tangible analytics.
Yes, you were talking about surge in online services and the demand for it, right? And I noticed there are a couple projects are not only about putting services out there, but it's about putting services in a fair and equitable way, right? And particularly, I think one of the things you mentioned is you have a program that will providing translation services, right? And you also have, you mentioned the broadband asset map. Seems to me these are manifestations of a digital equity. Can you tell us a little bit about how digital services help with this equity and how to make digital services more equitable in itself?
In the context of COVID-19, what you were seeing was, we all remember, as the evidence and facts were emerging, people who had to maintain websites or maintain content were just racing to keep updating things because we were learning things every day, every hour. And of course, governments and health systems are very interested in making sure people have access to the most up-to-date information at any time. That's just critical in a crisis situation. Now, the challenge is, generally speaking, that content is initially written in English. And so then how do we make sure that we translate it? And so it's an easy thing. Well, it's just simple. You just translate it. It's not that hard. True. Mm-hmm. If you are doing that multiple times per day, and you're talking about very important things that, an error in the translation is extremely bad just because people can get hurt. It's not just, oh, they, might show up at the post office at the wrong time and discover it's closed. Like this was health information and critical information. So as this was being updated, governments everywhere were sort of scrambling to make sure that we could keep it up to date and in multiple languages. And so the project from cohort 1, which we call ELSA, Easy Localization System Access, was a proof of concept that showed how is it that we could make a continuous translation system. So basically, as you're updating the content in English, it's actually using machine translations to quickly run a first pass translation using machines, so using things like common translation engines, to make sure that that content is at least preliminarily translated into another language. And then with the option of exploring in future, bringing in those human translators to actually double check that anything that the machine has done is accurate. And so having that done continuously was absolutely critical. And so we use the ELSA tool. It has its own website and it's an open source project. So we're happy to share the GitHub links for that. And you can see the information on the ELSA project. But that's a critical one because we can't have a situation where people who aren't English proficient aren't able to get the information when they need it. So that is a great example of how a technology helps with equity. With regard to the broadband asset map, and that is just a fascinating project because it's another great place where I would describe it as no human, it's the challenge that you're addressing with that tool is there's a bunch of information that a person needs to look at all at once to make a determination about where some broadband investments should be made. But if you look at all of the data that one must consider, it's just simply too much for the human brain to hold all at once. And so this tool helps people overlay different data sources and toggle things on and off so that they can compare and contrast between options.
So the other thing that I'm really curious about is people have been saying so fast that this vaccine has been passed, has been approved, and they were wondering whether or not these pandemic speed would be able to sustain over regular time. And maybe he will also take a step back and saying, is it even desirable? Not to mention feasible, but is it even desirable to do this at faster speed? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So, while I'm not an epidemiologist or a vaccine maker, I can't comment on exactly the vaccine question, but I think one of the things we learned and we've written about on our CTO blog is about how how can we replicate some of the efficient decision making and efficient product development that we saw in the context of the NYCX Innovation Fellows Program and the way we really just pulled together and were able to quickly ship product. As I said with that example of a pickup soccer game, that when we sort of set the parameters and set the constraints of how these products are going to be built and adhere to these digital era ways of building product that, as I mentioned, are very familiar. They're less familiar in government, but very familiar in the tech industry. Those approaches are an excellent way to replicate and work at speed because there's a really clear way to build product. And so ultimately, I think your question of is there anything we can learn about speed or what my thought is on that? I think it, in the case of digital tools, ultimately becomes a product management question. And so how do governments and how do organizations build product quickly and how do they have effective governance and oversight processes?
So you talk about digital tool management, and I would like to ask you, what are your overall thoughts on the role of digital governance in delivering public services?
Yeah, absolutely. Huge fan of it. So there's really famous structures and they're publicly available. So things like digital service standards, also sometimes known as just service standards, but that really is the guidebook that tells you exactly how to do this work. And I say that because I've done this in 3 different countries, this type of work, not in the context of a pandemic, of course. I would argue that teams that can familiarize themselves with this way of working are at a huge advantage to move quickly. Because what I often see is people asking the question of, well, how will we do this? Or how will we have oversight? Or how will we have structure? And I speak a lot about this at talks and say that those are actually solved problems. Stand on the shoulders of giants. Look to the people who've done this because the governments who've produced this work, in some cases have done it for the last decade. And they haven't just done it, they've been iterating and doing user research on it. And you can request it from them. I have evidence from the United Kingdom of their research on their own process and how they would improve their own process, which I then used when I was spinning up a process in a different jurisdiction. And that gives you a really great way to set up, and actually I call it like leapfrog, or I often say there's no first mover advantage in setting up these new governance approaches. So the approaches are really there, and they're very broad and they are flexible. And so they are kind of really your pathway forward if you'd like to adopt them. So huge fan of these governance approaches. And I encourage anyone who's interested in this work to just familiarize themselves with it. It's written in plain language. It's not intimidating technology lingo. It really is sort of a set of common sense ways of doing it. And once you start to read different jurisdictions versions, you think, oh, I see, this is actually a set model and a set play.
Nice, nice. So for those who are teaching public services, what would be your advice to them in terms of teaching public services in digital age?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and one that I'm really excited to talk about because, aside from just doing COVID-19 crisis response, I have been involved in teaching and lecturing either on the interaction design side, but also sometimes at schools of public policy. So I'm really passionate about getting people who are teaching in this space or students in this space excited about these digital era ways of working, especially because I think I'm someone who didn't actually come from a technology background. So I recognize when some people are like, oh, technology, I'm scared of that. And it can be, people can disengage. I'm not writing code. This doesn't apply to me, or this is confusing to me. And that's why I mentioned a moment ago that a lot of this stuff is written in plain language and it is really accessible. So ultimately what we're trying to teach people is that the great question to ask anyone working in any field is, do you think you'll be using less technology next year than you are this year? And the answer universally is no. I intend to do more technology next year. So if that is the case, if that is a given that we're going to be doing ever more things related to technology, then what we need to do is give people the culture, the processes, the practices, the technology of the internet era to help people respond to the raised expectations of constituents. So what that means are these digital era ways of working. And when I say that, I mean things like product management, not project management. That is an important skill, but product management is a different thing. And you can sort of look up the qualifications. I'm not saying that everybody needs to be, a certified Scrum Master or something like that, but understanding how digital products are built. And I say that this is, one of the most important skill sets for this reason. Building a user-centered product is actually very different than building something like a bridge. User-centered products are continuously iterated, and how you manage and oversee those products are very different than if you made a drawbridge over a river. Once you've built it, you're not going to be able to iterate it later. I mean, you could rebuild it, it'd be very disruptive. Whereas if you're a technology company, you are constantly changing and updating how that product works. And so unlike a bridge, where usually you wouldn't release a minimum viable product for a bridge, and minimum viable product is sort of defined as the smallest unit of a functioning product possible. So you could imagine a suspension bridge, but with no guardrails. It would be a terrible idea. People would fall off of it. Don't do that. Doesn't work in that sort of construction. When it comes to digital products, you could build a scheduling system that doesn't give people text notifications. That could be later, you might give them text notifications, but in the first minimum viable product release, you don't need that. So helping people to understand how you'd manage a product that's digital, that can be updated, that can use data and analytics to guide the development. Because in digital product development, we want to release something early and often so people can use it. We can look at that analytics and say, oh, that's interesting. Nobody's using this feature. Let's stop building that because nobody likes it, and let's build this other thing that everyone's interested in. You can't do that with a suspension bridge. And it's really about shipping products early and often. So doing these smaller interventions and building on them rather than trying to build the whole system all at once and doing one big release, which is very risky.
Is there anything that you would like to tell us that has not been asked?
Oh, wow, I'm so unprepared for this question. Well, yes, I think if there's something, an additional comment I would say is that the work that was done during the COVID-19 pandemic was, and not just in the city of New York, but in digital government teams across the world, was, I believe, fantastic and really great work. But we need to continue to scale and build more resilient teams. So certainly, responding to a crisis is one thing, but how we build and prepare for any future situation that arises, but also for this, 21st century era way of working is really important. I really have to reinforce, I'm not suggesting that, chatbots are going to replace humans, but I do think that, many of the ways in which people get information, in which they apply for services, in which they engage with government is increasingly a digital one. And so their expectations are going to be that government services feel as good as some of the e-commerce experiences that they have. And so to that end, looking at some of the skills that we saw or capacity gaps that we had during the COVID-19 pandemic response and saying going forward, how can we develop more skills in this area? Or even if my job isn't necessarily digital, is there a book that I might want to read that helps me better understand this way of working? Because I think it has a huge potential to promote equality, to promote access. The idea we always tell people to keep in their mind is, imagine a single parent sitting at home after they put the child to bed and they're trying to transact with government from their mobile phone. They're sitting on the couch. They might not have a desktop computer. They might not have a laptop. They might not have the latest generation of smartphone. We want to make this simple, seamless, and intuitive for that person because they're probably tired, they've worked a long day, and we want to get them what they need in a simpler, a faster, and better way. So, and in order to do that, technology can be a huge role. And when we do that, of course, it reduces some of the barriers people have to access. So I think that's maybe the only thing that I would add, unless there's anything you'd like me to elaborate on.
Thank you very much. I think that's pretty much all the questions that I have here, and so we appreciate your time, and we look forward to better, more wonderful work that you're doing for our city. So thank you very much, Katherine. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Professor Liu. It was lovely to be here.